In some ways, the quote-unquote digital ag revolution has moved quite a bit slower than a lot of people predicted. Lawrence King has built a career and a business around helping to make sure that the digital tools in agriculture being built can actually find the market traction they desire.
Really understanding, are we building the right thing, is what's most important. And it's that research that you put in the beginning that most people want to shortchange.
Just because we can build it doesn't mean we should, and this goes for all technologies. Even new and interesting advancements like generative AI, which we talked about a couple episodes ago, they're still just tools that need to fulfill an existing market need.
From an AI perspective, it just goes down to, does it do things cheaper, faster, or better? It's super simple. If it doesn't, don't invest in it. But do take a hard look and see where it can make things cheaper, faster, or better.
Lawrence's company, Headstorm, works with clients all throughout the ag value chain to help them manage and implement large-scale tech initiatives. They also have recently launched a product of their own called AGPILOT to help ag retailers use generative AI to better serve their farmer customers.
Right now, there's traditionally been two interfaces for users to get into systems. I believe that generative AI is going to create a third channel into systems to get data, and that's through conversation.
Headstorm's Lawrence King on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Well, hello, fellow ag nerds. My name is Tim Hammerich, and every week, you and I get to hear from the founders, farmers, innovators, investors, the people shaping the future of the ag industry. Before we dive in today, I want to take just a moment to recognize our quarterly presenting sponsor this quarter, which is actually Lawrence's company, Headstorm, engineering growth for the farms of tomorrow. Headstorm is a full-service technology consultancy with been there, done that knowledge and expertise in the ag industry. The team at Headstorm knows which digital strategies work and which ones don't work based on the competitive landscape across broadacre, specialty, and animal ag industries. Realize your business objectives through innovative solutions and focused product strategy. Swiftly bring ideas to life from proof of concept to MVP with elite product strategy and engineering. Headstorm provides a holistic and actionable technology roadmap that bridges the gap between strategy and implementation. From inception to execution, they help you play to your strengths, mitigate your weaknesses, and make technology your unfair advantage. Learn more at headstorm.com. That's just headstorm.com. I'll leave a link for that in the show notes. And thank you very much to Headstorm for supporting ag innovation and the Future of Agriculture podcast. All right, now back to today's featured conversation with Headstorm CEO Lawrence King. Lawrence has over 18 years of technology and strategy consulting experience. He got his start in ag tech with Farmlink over 8 years ago. Some of you may remember that name, where he built an engineering team. Farmlink ultimately ran into some hard times, and Lawrence found himself with a super talented team of engineers and no work to do. So he tapped into his contacts in ag tech who might be at that time looking for strategy and engineering talent, and Headstorm was then born. Today, Headstorm has worked with companies all throughout agriculture and in some similar industries as well who want to implement large-scale technology initiatives in their businesses. He'll give a few examples of what that looks like in practice. Also, Headstorm recently announced a product of their own called AgPILOT, which uses generative AI to serve as a tool for ag retailers and other agronomists, kind of a new interface, as Lawrence calls it, to record and access data that ultimately allows them to better serve farmer customers. He's going to talk more about AgPILOT today as well. Lawrence has a lot of battle-tested wisdom about what works and what doesn't work in ag tech, and he shares a lot of those insights in today's episode. I'll drop you into the conversation here with him reflecting on what led him from tech to ag tech all those years ago.
I got into the ag space because I got an opportunity to work on a project in agriculture a long time ago called Farmlink. And so that was fascinating to me because as an engineer, I got the benefits of working with maps and equipment and the cloud and all of these new technologies that most people don't realize are in agriculture.
Yeah. And what year was this? This is a while ago.
2013, 2014.
Okay. Early days of what we now call ag tech.
Early days. And so, it was around benchmarking yields for growers that are in the same area. And it was fascinating. The interfaces were great, intuitive, informative. The only problem was I don't think growers were really ready to adopt that type of technology. And so, you kind of look at the usage metrics, and I would kept scratching my head going, man, being the developer, developing it, I'm like, I could see the value, but I think that sort of tells the early story of no matter how informative or how, pretty these maps are, there's probably a better way to provide this information to growers because adoption's pretty important.
Yeah. And then, so were you with Farmlink until the end, or did you?
Well, mostly they had several rounds of funding. And so I built a team, which eventually became Headstorm on Farmlink. And so mostly till the end. And then we reached out on LinkedIn, I reached out to 8 different companies, Climate being one of them. And I think I got 8 responses from their CTOs. And at the time, I thought, wow, LinkedIn is really amazing. But it turns out that a lot of folks were aware of what was going on at Farmlink, and having a large part of the engineering team come available was appealing to some of these other organizations trying to build similar applications for growers.
And the response, obviously, because of that success rate, they were looking for somebody like this. As you kind of got into the discovery process with them, what were the problems at that time that companies were facing?
Yeah, good question. So I think there were a lot of companies that were trying to build similar functionality, but in different ways. And so the folks that we had spoken with, it was really, Climate Corporation stood out to me. I got an opportunity. Mark Young took my call and was the first one to interview me. And I really liked him. And he shared with me what Climate was trying to achieve at the time. And it felt very similar to Farmlink. And the fact that they were in San Francisco was interesting. And I thought, man, we're in Dallas. We're going to have to go kind of impress these San Francisco guys to see if they'll take us in as one of their own, being from Dallas. And so we ended up, our first project was on the field view application. And so getting my team integrated and trying to work with folks from San Francisco and different geographies and whatnot, and sort of prove ourselves out, because we didn't really have, not being in San Francisco or Seattle or one of the big technology areas put us a little bit of a disadvantage, because who are these folks from Dallas? And so, being able to come in and side by side show our worth and our value. It took about a year or two probably to really kind of get the respect of the other development teams. And that was a much larger organization, but it was worth it. We met a lot of good relationships along the way. And that was really what solidified, hey, we're going to stay in agriculture. And so for us, agriculture is probably 70% of our revenue. And the other areas are somehow tangential to agriculture. So think of finance and crop lending. If you kind of put a wider lens on it, a lot of our revenue comes from agriculture.
It's ancillary in some way. And have the problems stayed pretty consistent? And would you describe it as sort of, engineering strategy and support and custom development, or how would you describe the services? Because they probably run a gamut.
Yeah, so we started in engineering. It was predominantly engineering. And so that's a lot of taking orders from product managers and just being sort of handed down. Here's our strategy. Here's the product roadmap. Here's the requirements. Build this. And so over the years, as we started to build these things and not see them really resonate within the market, and having enough experience kind of under our belt to be able to have a point of view, we started pivoting into having a say in the product. Well, maybe we should interview some of these growers. Maybe we should, whoever the persona is that we're trying to sell to, let us just go and have conversations. We had started to build a little bit of a network that we could call on at that time. So if they didn't want to have to spend money and provide those types of personas to us, we could go out and validate it within our own network. And that was really helpful because it opened up a lot of blind spots into what the approach and the strategy was. And then we started getting, as we did more of that, we started to really frame up a stronger point of view on what things are working, what digital products are working in agriculture, and which ones aren't working, and what's the common theme there. And so that got us into more strategy work of, okay, there's a lot of money being spent in developing either digital tools in the agriculture space or investing in infrastructure to scale up to handle the anticipated demand of what these products could achieve. And the value that we're providing there is that we didn't really see at the point is, how do you create a business case in the very beginning that says, if I go to the executive team or I go to the board and I ask them for X amount of dollars, that I can, with confidence, or at least a reasonable level of confidence, explain to them what the outcomes are, whether that's going to be increase in revenue, improved profitability, enterprise value. And so we really started focusing on building the business case first and providing that to our clients. And that's what's resonated. And sometimes when we put these technology strategies together, it's a roadmap for 3 years. And there's lots of initiatives on there. And so that's been a lot more impactful because we're able to leverage, 10 years of scars in the ag space of building these things and really bring that to value.
And can you give an example of what that looks like in practice? I don't know how many specifics you can share, but of an example of a client that kind of needed that expertise to come in and help with.
So lots of different clients. So I could tell one for let's think trapping. The idea, the hypothesis was if we were to provide a digital solution that allowed us to have cameras in traps that we could understand which types of pest pressure was coming in, that would be a value add that we could then give to our sales folks to then give to the customers. And so that was an opportunity to really get in and understand, number one, who's using this. And if it's the grower, then we need to get their input, which we didn't have at the time. But we need to understand how are they using this tool and what would be of value to them. And so being able to talk with the grower and understand how they're using the tool helped really inform how we built it, as opposed to the company that was providing it to the grower. They had their point of view on how it should work. And there was a lot of internal domain knowledge around kind of engineering seemed to sneak their way in to decide how the particular product worked. But being able to go to the grower directly who's using it and get that information, incorporate that back in, made it a lot more successful. And so the rollout was much easier. The training was much easier. The adoption was far better than what it would have been otherwise.
Sure. No, I appreciate
that's just a simple example. But
yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And I really believe in that need to start the adoption part of things in the development, very, very early on. I'm curious from you, because you made a comment that you kind of saw at Farmlink from an engineering side, like, okay, this stuff is cool and it's advancing and it's looking interesting, but from an adoption side, it just wasn't there yet. I mean, we were really early, obviously. What at that point, though, kept you committed that, no, the world is headed in this direction. I want to kind of double down on this, even though I'm not seeing the adoption that we'd like to see right now.
Right. Well, at the time, I didn't have a whole idea about kind of the industry strategy and where I saw the industry going. I just saw the technology and I was enamored by that. I'm like, man, if I could continue working with these maps and working with equipment in the cloud, this is amazing. Over time, it was, once we start building some of these things and we start seeing some of the usage numbers and we're kind of scratching our heads, that was where I realized that we had to pivot more into product. And a lot of it, I think the biggest missing gap has been getting information from the customer that you're selling to, whether that's growers, whether it's agronomists, and then dividing those customer groups into segments of personas. Because you may be selling to a grower, but there's enterprise growers and there's investors and executives and ranch managers and staff. And so who's using the app and what do they find value? And then why would an investor or the executives pay for that value? How can you communicate the value of a digital tool to all those personas? And that's just within growers. And so really understanding, are we building the right thing is what's most important. And it's that research that you put in the beginning that most people want to shortchange. And what's interesting is you don't have to do a lot of it. It's not like you need you think about a statistically significant data set. So it's not like you need a 10% sample of all of your potential customer base. You really just need to get the right folks at the table to have conversations, whether that's focus groups or just individual interviews, to at least baseline, are we building the right thing? I can tell you there's been companies that we've helped that in, for example, soil testing in Iowa. The packaging for sending out soil testing and the soil testing kits came in little vials with little droplets that were really pretty packaged. And when we actually went out to do the soil sampling with the lab in Iowa, we were on the back of a four-wheeler with paper bags and basically a pipe that you jump on and slam into the ground because it's freezing in Iowa and the ground's frozen. And then you shake the soil out of the pipe into the bag and then you write what field or zone that's in, and then you pop it on the back fork and you take off and you're at your next one. I don't think anyone for this particular client had even gone through that process. I mean, these were little tiny little vials with a little solution in there to make sure that, there was no corruption or whatnot, put in this really beautiful packaging. And then to see how it was done, there was a huge disconnect.
Right. They're not going to dump a probe in there.
Right. Yeah. And so all the money spent to develop this and go through the design and go through the production of getting all of this packaging could have been avoided just by sending somebody out to go walk in the shoes of the customer for a day.
Interesting. And I imagine it's not always that simple, though. You probably get into some more complex issues as well. What does that look like from your services? Is it always kind of like, how do we make sure that this product is actually meeting the needs of a customer, or is it usually in that disconnect, or what other examples can you share?
Well, I think before even getting to the customers, I think you could do some initial customer validation, because most of these companies come at it with a hypothesis. Hey, if we invest X in Y, we expect Z return. And so I think that a lot of it is being a little bit flexible in the beginning to say, hey, is that our persona? And so one of our takeaways now, or our point of view now, is that if you're selling digital self-service tools or applications to growers, you really need to make sure to validate that there's a market there in the first place. And that can be complex. If you're focused in a particular crop type, if you're focused on a particular farm size, your market starts shrinking. If you're dependent on data that's on the farm, and you're only connected with a few OEMs, well, that market size shrinks because maybe the OEMs that you're already integrated with aren't in this particular region. And so I think, going in and having those conversations to validate your hypothesis, hey, if it's enterprise growers, that's great, but have conversations. What we found is a lot of these enterprise growers, they're very complex and sophisticated. Some of them have their own engineering teams that are building out their own homegrown solutions that are fairly sophisticated. So understanding what their capabilities are, understanding, some range finding in terms of price. Do you find this of value? What if we did this? Where would there be value? What would you be willing to pay? How would you be willing to pay for this? And, getting a lot of that information up front can invalidate these hypotheses to then focus on other things that may have legs.
Yeah. And one observation from the outside for me is that the technology piece maybe at one point was the hard part. But now, whether it's AI or just, cloud services or whatever the case may be, the technology is actually becoming more accessible, probably cheaper to develop. So what becomes more important is exactly what you're talking about, is the strategy behind it.
That's right. And so we hear a lot that, we don't want to build another point solution. Well, point solutions have a place as we're talking about solutions for growers directly. The reason they have a place is because they're probably pretty good at creating a feedback loop, meaning that if they're paying this amount per acre for this digital solution, they've got a pretty good idea of what the impact is on yield or quality. That's an important feedback loop to have in place. If you don't have that in place, you really can't rest assured that your customer is going to feel value out of this. It's just another tool. I don't know how it's attributing to, my operations profitability. And that's sort of the key. And so we look at it saying, okay, what is the feedback loop? How can we attribute, whether it's an irrigation solution or a crop protection solution, how can we quickly identify and attribute that cost to an outcome, either in yield and quality or labor reduction? And so unless there's that really tight connection there, it's going to be really hard to solve, because if you don't have that tight connection, then what's going to happen after that is the technology piece, while a lot of it's there, there's a big interoperability challenge. You need a lot of data from a lot of different systems to be able to start doing attribution to yield and quality. And so being able to stitch all that data together is a challenge. And I think a lot of companies get into this and they say, hey, I think we've got a direct line to, yield and quality. We got the feedback loop, but then they'll get into it and realize, oh, well, the folks who we're integrated with don't have a presence in this region. So now we have to go find who does have a presence in that region and go try to build integrations with those companies, which they may be open to integrate. They may not be open to integrate.
Yeah. When you all work with a client, is it usually a project to project basis? A lot of the examples you've been giving seem like something that would have kind of a clear sort of endpoint.
Yeah. We prefer to work that way because we want to be measured on our outcomes. And so when we structure our engagements with our clients, typically it's very outcome based. And because we're standing behind, a lot of times we're building the business case for the investment. And so we want to make sure that we hit whatever we promised and committed to. Normally we'll do a project to project base, but there's a backlog of projects that need to be done. And once we proved ourselves out the first time, we've been on time, on budget. It's when we built trust, it's very easy then to start being asked to do work on other projects. And so that's been, for us, agriculture, the whole industry from our perspective is very trust oriented. We want to embrace that and make sure that at the very least, we do what we say we're going to do. And if we don't, we've got a really strong partnership to figure out, a plan B. That's been successful in this space. We haven't tried to buck the system. In a lot of other industries, you can be very transactional. But for us, the relationships, it's a small network of people within agriculture, and we want to make sure that we honor those relationships.
Yeah. And with your vantage point, working across several different players in ag and ag tech, what do you see as changing currently? What are sort of the groundswells or shifts underfoot right now in agriculture that are going to impact how this conversation might go in a year or two?
Yeah. If I was to think about it, I think interoperability is a major talking point, a major issue. There's so much fragmentation and so much data and insights that are siloed across thousands of organizations. I think solving that is going to be important. I think that the way that I think about it, at least in-field data and, data coming off of the farm, a lot of that, to the extent that it's driven by machinery and equipment, which a lot of it is, I'm thinking drones, sensors, none of the remote sensing, but on-field type equipment. I think that rather than stitching, someone has to come in and stitch all that together into one platform. I don't think that that's the job of an input company. I don't think it's the job of the retailer. I think it's actually the job of the OEMs that are out there through acquisition and consolidation to start acquiring the smaller equipment companies and get interoperability that way. This is in the long term. I think until then, I think that there's some really valuable steps in the right direction. So the ADMA platform with Microsoft, and then Bayer's ag-powered services on top of that. I think that has a lot of legs, and we're certainly excited about partnering with them. I think the interoperability piece is going to be kind of the big challenge over the next 3 to 5 years. I think the types of solutions that we're bringing is going to change as well. I think that, there's a lot of focus on sustainability. And to the extent that we can correlate sustainability with profitability, I think there's a win there. I think sustainability for sustainability's sake is going to be a real challenge. So we've been talking with companies about how do they invest in that and what outcomes are they trying to achieve on that side. And that all involves interoperability. And so our focus, and in fact, we're announcing our AGPILOT application, which is a lot about interoperability. We're leveraging ADMA and ag-powered services to help stitch together a lot of these siloed data sources to provide better insights and more coverage, at least in the US market.
Talk more about that, who that's for and what the outcome is going to be from that.
So from our learnings about building self-service solutions direct to growers, we thought, let's focus on the agronomists. Let's not buck the channel. Let's invest in what's already there and working. And so we wanted to focus on 3 things: enriching relationships. So agronomists have, enriched relationships with their customers. Productivity. How do we help them manage more customers? And then how do we give them differentiated expertise? Those 3 things. And in the retail side, it's very competitive and a commoditized market. The only true competitive advantage in that space from a services perspective is through being an expert advisor or a trusted advisor to the grower. And in order to get there, you need to, have constant communications with your grower, and you need to provide them differentiated expertise that they wouldn't otherwise get. And that's how you sort of carve off and protect your market share. Being able to differentiated expertise, how are we getting weather notifications and pest and disease pressures and notifying agronomists early so they can then reach out to their customers? And so this is a perfect use case where you could say, hey, we could provide that directly to growers, or you could give it to your agronomist to then provide to the growers. I think that's what's more consistent with the ordinary operations of the channel, is to give it to the agronomists and give them a reason to reach out, make them sort of the heroes and the experts in the space. And so some of those weather notifications, some of the satellite imagery, a lot of the OEM data that they may need to go into insights, that is part of the interoperability picture. And so that's where I think ADMA and ag powered services come into play, because I don't know of anyone that's bringing this data in as quickly as they are. We're sort of betting on that piece of it, because as they're bringing in all of these different raw data sets, we're able then to look through and see what's valuable and what use cases we can then build for the agronomists and give them that differentiated expertise.
Okay. And so along those lines, let's talk sort of about data privacy and data security. So you mentioned kind of the big players involved. How do I make sure that if I'm a part of this, that I'm still the owner of my data and that it's being used to help me, not work against me?
Right. I think there's consensus across the industry. We even think about data ownership, right? I think there's consensus that the farmer owns the data. So then it's, do we have the right data sharing agreements in place? And has the farmer consented to sharing that data in each chain? I mean, if you think about data, it's really like a crop, and there's a value stream to how that data is used. It gets refined and insights are created and those are sold off. And so I think that having transparency for the grower in how their data is being used, that they have the authority to grant access and not grant access. And so if they understand how their data is being used, and they also have the authority to grant and withdraw access, I think those are the two fundamental pieces. And as long as that stays intact, as data gets refined and transferred and shared down the chain, I think that that's important, and that'll solve that need of who owns it. The privacy pieces of it, you can anonymize a lot of this, and there's procedures in place to be able to do that, such that you're not giving away any secret sauce. And then on the security side, I think to the extent that a lot of these things are built with, certainly Microsoft Azure or AWS or in the cloud, a lot of that comes out of the box, and it makes it a lot easier. And so the security piece, while security is extremely important and we're focused on that, we're probably more focused on making sure that that chain of data sharing is transparent, and that the growers and the original owners of this data have transparency and the authority to be able to grant and withdraw access.
What has been, I think you're addressing some of it with this AGPILOT. What traditionally has been the reason why someone with enough critical mass, like an OEM, hasn't really seemed to tackle interoperability?
Competitive advantage.
But couldn't it be a competitive advantage to be the leader in that?
Absolutely. I think that there's a little bit of a risk there. And so you have to ultimately somebody has to be accountable and in charge of the hub, right? Who's that going to be? And I think that there'll be a lot of conflict around there, especially with the big players, of who's in charge of that. And to get folks, the executives of some of these large players into a room to try to iron that out is a challenge. Just as much as building treaties between countries are challenges, I think that this is much like that. It's a fairly technical, a lot of this stuff. And so, getting the right expertise in the room, getting the right people to the table, and then what are the outcomes? I think that has yet to be defined. So if, the big OEMs and the big input companies all get together and they start, allowing free access of sharing data between, the question becomes, well, what could we do with the data on our own? Why should we share it? If we do, is there a greater outcome? What is that greater outcome? That's really hard to quantify. And, I would be, if I was in the position of being executive for an OEM, those would be the questions I would be asking. And, what's going to bring them to the table? And so I think that, there probably needs to be a Switzerland that does own the hub, right? And that's sort of what we're starting to see evolve, I think, from my perspective, with ADMA having Microsoft kind of be the Switzerland as far as within the ag space. That might be an adequate Switzerland to allow for the OEMs and the input companies to start sharing data. I don't think it'll work if one OEM or one input company sort of manages the hub. I think it does have to be somebody out of industry. But, I think that if we really want to get to where they're fully automated farms, where weather events come in and you can change up the recommendations and the instructions to the machines that are immediately pushed down, to the planters or to the irrigation equipment, you're going to need full interoperability and you're going to need full data sets. But that's sort of the vision that I see in 50 years, right? Once there is complete access across the board to all of this data, there are some pretty big outcomes that can be achieved, at least as far as sustainability and efficiency is concerned.
And does it feel like we've already made progress to that end, or are we still sort of wandering around in the desert, so to speak?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, we come into conferences like this, and first indicator is I could have swore I heard this very same panel say the very same things last year. In fact, I was joking. We could have just recorded last year's and replayed it to ourselves and not had to pay a fee. But, I hear the same things as it applies to interoperability. And you would like an industry to be able to proactively build consensus within their industry, take advantage of it, and not rely on regulation. But it will eventually be regulated if they don't solve it for themselves. And this happened in healthcare with medical records. That was siloed between lots of hospitals and EMR companies, and it required legislation to really make that interoperable. And so I see a similar thing. If we can't solve it, the big OEMs and input companies can't solve it, then regulation will. And I don't think anyone wants that either.
And based on learnings from healthcare, what would that hypothetical situation of regulation and legislation look like for a farmer?
I think it would be beneficial to the farmer. I think it would give you a lot of say over your information, similar to your own medical records, right? It'll give you the authority to allow to grant access and withdraw access, just like it is in healthcare. I think what you will have is you'll create a standard. So there's a certain standard for how all this data is now communicated for the purpose of interoperability. And, in agriculture, that means that an outside party is going to set the standard of how to describe certain entities and domains within agriculture. And that may come from expertise in the industry, but there's risk there that it doesn't match how we think of the world in agriculture when we think about fields and zones. And so once that standard comes out and it becomes legislation, now everybody's going to have to adapt their systems to fit that new standard, which can be fairly costly if you haven't planned for that ahead of time. And some of the partnerships that may give you competitive advantage if you start solving it yourself, that sort of goes away because now it's going to be enforced across the industry. And so I think there's some opportunities now to avoid. I think as a company, how we think about it is these partnerships for interoperability now sort of become your moat in a lot of ways. But it requires opening dialogue and really working through what are the expectations of a partnership. But those who are doing that early right now are going to have more advanced insights that they'll be able to deliver to their customers and more value than those who are going to not want to partner and sort of stay within their echo chamber. And so that's how we're thinking about it now for the next 5 years at least. And that's what we're trying to do a lot with AgPILOT is the differentiated expertise part is really important. And there's even companies out there that specialize in identifying one disease, but they do it really, really well. Well, that's something we want to bring into our platform and be a channel for them, for a revenue source for them. And not everybody is going to have the best models. And so it's a matter of partnering with the companies that are specialized in certain areas and building, a portfolio of partnerships that allow you to have a competitive advantage over a competitor that's in your space.
Interesting. I wonder, I've talked to some people who feel like, with the amount of money that had been going into ag tech, kind of crescendoing, and there's a little bit of dust settling with the amount of new companies raising millions of dollars and coming out, where now it becomes a little clear, like, okay, we're sort of in this for a long haul. Maybe we can partner up, when before they were just getting inundated with all these new players they'd never heard of before.
Absolutely. Even some of the big players are starting to have loose partnerships together.
Yeah.
And so that's encouraging. I think the amount of money it requires to solve the interoperability problem is more than most, even the big players, want to invest. And so then it's spreading the risk.
Well, I think certainly something that we're all going to leave this event probably tired of talking about is artificial intelligence, but I'd be remiss if I didn't bring it up here. Where do you see artificial intelligence playing a role today in agriculture, and how does that change here in the coming years?
Yeah, great question. So artificial intelligence is a pretty broad term. And so you think about that could be broken down into, machine learning, deep learning, expert systems, natural language processing. And so the ag space has been doing that for a long time. And, all the machine learning models to do yield predictions and all the forecasting, the imagery, that's been in agriculture for a while. I think that What's new to agriculture is more of the generative AI. So think of the LLMs and the conversational pieces to it. Our point of view is that right now there's traditionally been two interfaces for users to get into systems, through a desktop app or through a mobile app. I believe that generative AI is going to create a third channel into systems to get data, and that's through conversation and chat interfaces. And that's really where where we focused with AGPILOT is if you think about kind of the traditional way is click and drill down. If I need to get to a customer's data or I need to get to their agronomic field info or whatever that might be, I have to go to my customer. I have to start clicking down, down, and down. If you start thinking about the number of clicks, the amount of time it takes you to get to a piece of data that you're interested, that starts adding up over time. The chat interface allows you to simply ask the question and get the answer without any of the drill down. And so I see that becoming a third interface. So you'll still have a mobile app, but it's going to either incorporate a lot of chat or you'll have a separate chat app. And I even see these chat apps taking on being plugins into other applications. So think of Teams, think of Slack, think of Dynamics. You're going to start seeing chat interfaces pop up in all of these applications. I think from an AI perspective, it just goes down to, does it do things cheaper, faster, or better? It's super simple. If it doesn't, don't invest in it. But do take a hard look and see where it can make things cheaper, faster, or better. If it does, create a use case for it, and then figure out how you're going to activate it. And either you're going to, like I said, you're going to build the capability internally, or what we tend to recommend more, there's lots of providers out there that are bringing these models online that even deploy them and maintain them in production so that you don't have to try to, maintain a staff of people that you have attrition. And that's a whole ecosystem of itself that has challenges. When you can simply license these things and quickly get them to market, maybe the model that you're building doesn't quite work or fit the use case. Well, if you licensed it, you can quickly, end that license and license another one. And so it allows for a lot of trial and error. If you start building that capability, you're probably 18 months out from an initial go-to-market feature. And so that's where taking companies and executives through this process really kind of starts framing up. So yes, we have use cases, and then how and when are they activated?
Right. Well, I really enjoy this. Before we wrap up, I'd like to know, is it still CTOs that typically you're working with that engage with you? If somebody's listening and, they really need to be reaching out to you, I'd like for them to know it's them.
Yeah, absolutely. So CTOs, of course, we do have relationships with CEOs and a lot of board members, but it's for us, it's about educating and providing a point of view on a lot of this stuff. And so normally it could start with a board member, and we kind of provide them a point of view that then makes its way to the CEO, and we have a conversation that goes to the CTO, or it starts with the CTO directly. But we've been in the space for a while, and I think that with our war wounds, we have a pretty strong point of view on where to place bets. And that's the value that we're bringing now. It's taken 7 years, or 10 for myself, just being in this space. But we're very passionate about agriculture, and we're passionate about bringing value to growers. We're passionate about the industry, and we're also passionate about the companies that we work with and making sure that the dollars that they invest, they're getting the outcomes that they expect.
All right. Well, huge thank you to Lawrence King for being on the show, and to Headstorm for sponsoring this Quarter of the Future of Agriculture podcast. That interview took place at World Agritech in San Francisco, and we've got some other interviews coming up from that event. So it was really productive to see a lot of great people all in one place, all talking about agtech and the future of agriculture. So I'm excited to share more of these interviews with you. Would love to take a moment, though, just to hear your feedback on the podcast. It's been a while since I've kind of asked for feedback specifically. So I'd love to hear what's working, what's not working for you when it comes to the show. Always open to feedback on our content via email, tim@aggrad.com, LinkedIn, Twitter, or however else you send messages these days. I'm not on all the platforms, but I'm sure you can track me down. Thanks so much for your time and your attention. I don't take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.